The Thunderbolt came in crooked. Left wing dipped low, engine coughing black smoke and uneven pulses, the big Pratt and Whitney radial running rough enough that the crew chief could hear the cylinder misfire from 200 yards out. This particular P-47 had taken hits before. Every fighter in the squadron had by late 1944, but something about the approach looked wrong. The landing gear came down late. The flare was ugly. The tires barked against the pierced steel planking at RAF Boxted, and the whole airframe shuddered sideways before straightening out, rolling long, bleeding speed like the pilot had forgotten how to brake. Ground crew sprinted toward it. Standard procedure after a rough return. 2 armorers, a crew chief, a mechanic already scanning the cowling for oil leaks. The canopy slid back, and the pilot sat there for a beat too long. Face gray, right hand still wrapped around the stick. Left hand on the throttle quadrant, except the left hand hadn't moved during the landing, hadn't moved during the approach. The crew chief climbed the wing root and saw why. Blood on the throttle lever, blood on the trim wheel, and below the pilot's left elbow, where muscle and bone and tendon should have connected a forearm to a wrist, a rigid prosthetic device, leather straps, aluminum frame, a molded grip shaped to lock onto a throttle handle, sat bolted in place like it had always been there. It had always been there. The crew chief knew. The armorers knew. The line mechanics, the intelligence officer who debriefed this pilot after every sortie, the wingman who flew formation with him 3 times a week. They all knew. The one entity that didn't know, or at least maintained the bureaucratic fiction of not knowing, occupied a set of filing cabinets at 8th Air Force headquarters. The Army Air Corps had a regulation. Amputees don't fly combat. This pilot flew 67 missions over occupied Europe with one arm, and the paperwork never caught up to the cockpit. If that sounds like the kind of story worth remembering, and it is, subscribe to this channel and hit like so this reaches the people who should hear it. Drop a comment below. Tell me about the rule breakers in your family, the ones who weren't supposed to be there but showed up anyway. The P-47 he flew that day had 14 holes in the fuselage, 3 in the vertical stabilizer, 1 through the radio compartment that severed the antenna lead, flak damage, all of it, 88mm bursts from a battery near Aachen that had already knocked down 2 bombers from the formation this fighter group escorted, standard hazard for a Thunderbolt pilot in the fall of 1944. Nothing about the damage report mentioned the pilot's arm. Nothing about the damage report ever mentioned the pilot's arm. The prosthetic itself deserves a minute. It wasn't medical equipment. Not really. The VA hadn't issued it. No rehabilitation center designed it for cockpit use. The pilot, and the specifics of his identity, sit in a strange archival gap that I'll get to, had fabricated a custom rig with help from a stateside machine shop before deploying overseas. The device locked his residual limb into a fixed position against the throttle. He could push forward and pull back. Lateral movement required his right hand to leave the stick, reach across, and adjust. During combat maneuvering, that meant intervals of several seconds where he controlled the aircraft with throttle pressure and rudder pedals alone. No stick input. In a diving attack on a ground target, those seconds stretched. The engineering problem is fascinating and a little horrifying. A P-47 in a 60-degree dive builds speed fast. Terminal velocity with the engine at idle exceeds 400 miles per hour. Pull-out forces hit 5-6 Gs. A one-armed pilot executing that recovery has to time the stick pull perfectly because he can't simultaneously adjust power. He presets the throttle, commits to the dive, and rides it out with one hand on the controls and faith in the arithmetic he did before pushing over. 67 times. 67 times he rolled in on rail yards, truck convoys, airfields, flak positions. 67 times he recovered and flew home to an English airfield where everyone below the rank of colonel understood what they were looking at and said nothing. The squadron had its own math. A pilot who could fly and fight and come back mattered more than a regulation, written by someone who had never strapped into a cockpit with 30 caliber rounds coming through the windscreen. But how does a one-armed pilot end up in a combat squadron in the first place? How does the paperwork miss something that obvious? And what happens when the bureaucracy finally opens its eyes? To answer that, Everything has to rewind. Back before Boxted, before England, before the prosthetic. Back to the moment an American pilot lost his arm and decided that losing it changed nothing. The Jeep flipped at 40 miles per hour on a rutted supply road south of Tebessa. February 1943. The driver walked away. The passenger, a 24-year-old fighter pilot reassigned to a ground liaison role while his squadron waited for replacement aircraft, didn't walk anywhere for 3 days. The left arm absorbed the impact. Elbow joint shattered. Radius snapped in 2 places. The ulnar nerve, which runs a vulnerable path along the inside of the elbow and controls grip strength in the ring, and little fingers, severed cleanly against a fragment of bone. A field surgeon at the evacuation hospital stabilized the fractures with splints and morphine and wrote in his assessment that the arm would require extensive reconstruction stateside. He used a phrase that appears in the medical file, the actual file, which survived in the National Personnel Records Center despite the 1973 fire that destroyed millions of Army records. Probable permanent loss of functional capacity below the elbow. The surgeon underlined permanent. That underlining matters because everything that followed depended on one pilot's conviction that a field surgeon's underlining carried less authority than his own right hand on a stick. The evacuation chain should have sent him to Oran, then a hospital ship to Norfolk, then a medical board, then a discharge with disability percentage and a handshake. That chain had moved thousands of broken pilots out of North Africa by early 1943. Smooth process, well-oiled bureaucracy, doing exactly what bureaucracies do, categorizing damage, filing it, moving it along. He refused evacuation. The medical file shows 3 separate notations over 11 days in which the pilot declined transfer to the rear. The first 2 carry a tone of professional patience. The third, dated February 22nd, includes a note from the attending physician that reads, "Patient insists injury is improving and requests return to unit. Advised against. Patient became agitated." That word, agitated, covers a lot of ground in military medical shorthand. It means the conversation got loud. It means someone pulled rank who didn't have rank to pull. It means a lieutenant with a destroyed arm stood in a canvas tent in the Tunisian winter and argued with a captain who held his future in a carbon copy form. What happened next sits in an archival gap. The medical file shows the pilot present at the evacuation hospital on February 22nd. His unit records show him back with his squadron on March 9th. 15 days unaccounted for. No transfer orders survive. No amended medical evaluation explains how a pilot with a shattered elbow and severed nerve walked out of a hospital and back onto a flight line. The records don't say. They just resume, as if nothing interrupted them. The physical reality by March of 1943 looked like this. The fractures had begun to knit, badly, without proper surgical alignment, producing a slight angular deformity visible in a later X-ray. The severed ulnar nerve had not regenerated, would not regenerate. The left hand retained thumb and index finger function through the median nerve, but lost meaningful grip strength. He could close his fingers around a throttle lever. He could not squeeze hard enough to maintain hold under G-loading. The arm functioned as a positioning tool. He could place it where he needed it, but not as a gripping instrument. The difference between placing and gripping is the difference between flying a desk and flying a fighter, and every flight surgeon in the Army Air Forces knew it. So he stopped seeing flight surgeons. The periodic flight physical required for combat pilots happened every 6 months in theater. His squadron's medical officer, a general practitioner from Illinois with no surgical training and a patient load of 400 men, conducted these physicals in a tent with a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, and a form that asked about vision, hearing, cardiovascular function, and range of motion. Range of motion. The pilot could move the arm, could raise it, lower it, extend it. The form didn't ask about grip dynamometry or nerve conduction. It didn't ask whether the pilot could squeeze a control surface against aerodynamic forces exceeding 200 pounds. The form asked whether the arm moved, and it moved. Box checked. Flight status retained. The squadron medical officer either didn't notice or didn't want to notice. 12 pilots had died in his squadron since North Africa. Replacements arrived green and sometimes died before their fifth mission. A pilot with combat experience, proven judgment, and the ability to get an airplane back to base represented a resource that no medical form could quantify. The calculation wasn't complicated. A one-armed veteran or a two-armed replacement who'd never seen flak. The squadron needed the veteran. By summer of 1943, the pilot had begun working with a machinist in the engineering section on a device that would change the calculation entirely. A prosthetic throttle grip that turned a crippled arm into something the Army Air Forces had never seen and never authorized. What does a pilot's left hand actually do in a P-47 cockpit? More than most people think. The throttle quadrant sits on the left sidewall, angled slightly inboard, and it contains not one control, but four. Throttle lever, propeller pitch control, mixture control, supercharger selector. A healthy pilot manages all four with his left hand, while his right hand stays on the stick and his feet work the rudder pedals. During a routine cruise, the left hand rests on the throttle and makes minor adjustments every few minutes. During combat, during a diving strafing run on a German convoy or a hard brake turn to avoid flak, the left hand becomes a continuous instrument, modulating power, adjusting prop RPM, sometimes yanking the mixture to emergency rich to squeeze every last horsepower out of the R2800 engine before it detonates from overboost. The movements are small, precise. They require constant feedback from the hand, pressure, vibration, resistance. They require grip. He had no grip. The machinist who helped build the prosthetic worked in the squadron's engineering section and had previously fabricated custom gun sight mounts, modified canopy rails, bent sheet aluminum into shapes that Republic Aviation never intended. His name doesn't appear in any document I've found. The device he built does appear, described in a post-war medical assessment that catalogs the pilot's equipment with clinical detachment. Leather cuff, 6 inches long, buckled around the forearm proximal to the wrist, aluminum channel bolted to the cuff's outer surface, spring-loaded jaw mechanism at the channel's terminus, shaped to clamp over the P-47's throttle lever with approximately 35 pounds of locking force. 35 pounds matters. A P-47's throttle requires about 12 pounds of force to move through its full range under normal conditions. Under high-G maneuvering, friction loads on the throttle cable increased that figure to somewhere around 20 pounds. The spring jaw provided a margin of 15 pounds, enough to hold position during a 4G pullout, probably not enough during a 6G recovery from a steep dive. The pilot knew exactly where the margin disappeared. He flew inside it for 2 years. The device solved the throttle. It did not solve propeller pitch, mixture, or supercharger. Those 3 controls sat within inches of the throttle lever, and reaching them required the jaw mechanism to release, the arm to reposition, the jaw to re-engage on a different lever. In practice, the pilot preset prop pitch and mixture before entering combat and left them alone. Supercharger stage changes, necessary when climbing above 12,000 feet, where the single-stage blower couldn't maintain manifold pressure. He performed during non-critical phases of flight. Straight and level, no enemy in sight, right hand briefly off the stick to unlock the jaw, left arm repositioned, jaw re-engaged, adjustment made, 15 seconds minimum, 15 seconds of degraded aircraft control every time he changed a secondary setting. The comparison to Douglas Bader, the RAF's famous legless ace, illuminates more than it flatters. Bader lost both legs below the knee in a 1931 crash and flew Spitfires and Hurricanes through the Battle of Britain with prosthetic tin legs. Remarkable achievement, celebrated endlessly. But Bader's prosthetics replaced legs, and a fighter pilot's legs perform a comparatively simple function. Push left, rudder pedal. Push right, rudder pedal. Binary inputs. Force required is moderate. Feedback from the pedals matters less than feedback from the stick and throttle. Bader's hands worked perfectly. His most critical control interfaces remained intact. This pilot's situation inverted Bader's entirely. His legs functioned. His critical control interface, the left hand on the throttle quadrant, did not. and where Bader flew with the full knowledge and explicit authorization of the RAF, supported by medical waivers signed by Air Vice Marshals who decided his propaganda value exceeded his medical risk, this American flew in a bureaucratic shadow. No waiver, no authorization, no senior officer's signature accepting liability for a one-armed pilot who might crater into an English village on approach because his prosthetic jaw slipped off the throttle during a crosswind landing. The crosswind problem, incidentally, irritates me every time I think about it. A crosswind landing in a P-47 requires simultaneous aileron input from the stick, rudder input from the feet, and throttle modulation from the left hand, 3 limbs, 3 axes, all at once for about 15 seconds during the final phase of approach. A 2-armed pilot finds this challenging. A 1-armed pilot with a mechanical jaw clamp finds it. What? The records contain no incident reports, no landing accidents, no gear collapses, no ground loops, no runway departures attributed to this pilot across 67 missions. 67 crosswind-capable landings with a spring-loaded aluminum clamp where a hand should have been. The device worked. The engineering worked. The question that remained was not about engineering. It was about how long a conspiracy of silence could hold in the most documented Air Force in the world, an organization that generated carbon copies of everything and lost almost nothing. Colonel Harold Gruening signed 4 return-to-duty waivers in a single afternoon in November 1943. 4 pilots his flight surgeons had flagged for combat fatigue, tremors, weight loss, insomnia so severe that one lieutenant had fallen asleep during a pre-mission briefing and woken up screaming. Gruening commanded a fighter group in the 8th Air Force. He needed 18 combat-ready pilots to maintain operational tempo. He had 11. The waivers went through. The 4 pilots flew the next morning. One of them didn't come back, shot down over the Ruhr by a Focke-Wulf 190 that caught him in a turn. He started too late. Maybe fatigue, maybe bad luck, maybe both. The 8th Air Force Surgeon General's office tracked these numbers with the dispassionate precision of an actuarial table. In the 12 months between October 1943 and October 1944, fighter groups in the 8th reported a cumulative pilot deficit averaging 22% of authorized strength. Some groups ran worse. The 356th Fighter Group, the same group operating out of Boxted, dropped to 61% strength after a brutal week of escort missions in February 1944. 61%, 4 out of every 10 cockpits empty. The Surgeon General's quarterly report for that period uses language that borders on alarm. Return-to-duty pressures from operational commanders have in certain instances resulted in the premature restoration of flight status to personnel whose medical profiles indicate incomplete recovery. That sentence, buried on page 47 of a classified internal document, describes the ecosystem that kept a one-armed pilot in the air. It wasn't a conspiracy or a cover-up. It was something worse. A system so desperate for warm bodies in cockpits that it developed institutional blindness as a survival mechanism. Squadron commanders stopped asking questions they didn't want answered. Flight surgeons learned which boxes to check and which examinations to abbreviate. The carbon copies still flowed upward through channels, medical forms, fitness reports, mission summaries, but the information they carried had been pre-filtered at the source. A squadron CO, who knew his best pilot had a crippled arm, also knew that reporting it meant losing that pilot permanently, receiving a green replacement who might last 3 missions, explaining to group why his sortie rate had dropped, and absorbing the operational cost alone. The math kept doing itself. The USAAF's own statistics tell the story in aggregate. Between 1943 and 1945, the 8th Air Force flight surgeons processed over 11,000 combat fatigue evaluations. Of those, roughly 6,800 resulted in temporary grounding. Of those 6,800, more than 5,000 returned to flight status, and the Surgeon General's office later estimated that at least 15% returned before meeting the medical criteria for restoration. 750 pilots, minimum flying combat missions that their own doctors hadn't fully cleared them for. That 15% figure appears in a 1946 review, commissioned by the Army Air Force's Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright Field. The review's authors interviewed 32 flight surgeons who had served in the European theater. The findings were damning, even through the bureaucratic language. Operational necessity frequently superseded medical judgment in the determination of individual flight status. One flight surgeon, stationed with a bomb group at Thorpe Abbotts, told investigators that his group commander had explicitly instructed him to find a way to return grounded pilots to duty within 72 hours unless they presented gross physical disability. Gross physical disability. A missing hand qualifies. A hand that moves but cannot grip. A hand attached to an arm that looks normal under a flight jacket sleeve does not. The distinction between visible and invisible disability ran through the entire system like a fault line. A pilot missing a leg couldn't hide it. A pilot missing an eye couldn't pass a vision test, but a pilot with a functional-looking arm, wearing a leather cuff under his flight glove, strapping a custom clamp onto the throttle after the canopy closed, that pilot existed in a gray zone the regulations hadn't anticipated, and the overworked medical system couldn't detect without trying to detect it. Nobody tried. The squadron needed him more than the regulation needed enforcement. His wingman later described the collective silence with a phrase that captures the entire arrangement in 7 words. We all knew. Nobody said anything. That line comes from a 1981 interview conducted by a graduate researcher at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell. The wingman, by then a retired lieutenant colonel living in Tucson, spoke freely about the prosthetic, the missions, the unspoken agreement that protected the pilot from administrative scrutiny. The interviewer asked whether any officer had ever raised the issue formally. The response, "You have to understand how many guys we were losing. You didn't throw away a pilot who could fly." The clock on that silence, though, had already started running out. By September 1944, the 8th Air Force began implementing standardized flight physical protocols that replaced the old checkbox forms with hands-on functional assessments, grip strength measured with a dynamometer, range of motion tested under resistance, neurological screening for peripheral nerve damage. The new protocol arrived at Boxted in the 3rd week of October. The pilot had flown 63 missions. He had 4 left, black smoke rolling upward in columns so thick they cast shadows on the ground at 23,000 feet. Schweinfurt, October 14, 1943. The ball-bearing factories burned beneath a carpet of high explosive dropped by 230 B-17s that had fought their way through the densest fighter opposition the 8th Air Force had yet encountered. 60 bombers went down, 600 men. The escort fighters, P-47s operating at the ragged edge of their fuel range, turned back over Aachen, and the bombers flew the last 100 miles naked. His squadron peeled off at the fuel limit and landed at Boxted with gauges touching empty, 40 minutes of fuel remaining when they crossed the English coast. He'd flown the entire mission with his left arm clamped to the throttle, managing power settings across a 4-hour sortie that included a running engagement with Messerschmitt 109s over the Dutch border. 4 hours of vibration transmitted through an aluminum channel into a forearm held together by badly knitted bone. The Luftwaffe he faced that autumn still had teeth. JG-26 and JG-2 operated from bases in northern France and Belgium, close enough to scramble within minutes of radar contact, and their pilots included veterans with kill counts exceeding 50. These weren't the half-trained replacements who would populate German fighter units by mid-1944. Expert 10. Men who understood deflection shooting, who could read a formation's weak point from 2 miles out and attack from 12 o'clock high because they knew American bomber gunners had the worst field of fire directly ahead. Against these professionals, an American fighter pilot with a spring-loaded clamp for a left hand flew escort, stayed with the bombers, engaged when Messerschmitts pressed attacks and broke off when they didn't. The mission log, reconstructed from squadron records because his personal logbook has never surfaced, shows a pattern. Schweinfurt in October. Oschersleben in January 1944, part of the Big Week offensive that gutted German aircraft production. 2 Berlin raids in March, escort to Munich in July. Each mission longer than the last as P-51 Mustangs replaced the shorter-legged Thunderbolts, and the 8th pushed deeper into the Reich. He transitioned to the P-51 sometime in the spring of 1944. The Mustang's throttle quadrant differed from the Thunderbolt's. Different angle, different lever spacing, different resistance profile, different throw distance. The machinist modified the jaw mechanism. Sources conflict on whether this required a completely new device or an adjustment to the existing one. The Luftwaffe's own regulations would have grounded him immediately. The German flight medical system operated under Luftwaffe Dienstvorschrift L.DV.95/2, which specified minimum physical requirements for combat aircrew with a specificity that bordered on obsession. Grip strength measured bilaterally. Nerve conduction assessed by reflex testing. Any peripheral nerve injury producing measurable deficit in hand function resulted in permanent removal from flight status, category untauglich, unfit, no exceptions, no waivers. The system reflected a German military culture that trusted regulation over individual judgment and valued standardization above improvisation. A Luftwaffe pilot with a severed ulnar nerve would have been grounded on the day of diagnosis, reassigned to a training command or a staff position, his flying career terminated by a medical officer's stamp. The German system couldn't conceive of a combat pilot compensating for a destroyed hand with a homemade aluminum clamp because the German system didn't permit the question to be asked. The American system permitted everything it didn't explicitly catch. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, he had flown 41 missions. The squadron provided ground attack support over the Normandy beaches, strafing German positions along the coastal bluffs at altitudes low enough to smell cordite through the ventilation system. Low-altitude strafing in a fighter represents the most physically demanding flying in the combat repertoire. Constant throttle adjustments, power up on the attack run, power back in the pullout, power up again for the re-attack. Each adjustment transmitted through the jaw clamp. Each pullout loading the airframe to 4 Gs, maybe 5, the pilot's body weighing 800 pounds for 3 seconds, while the clamp held the throttle against 20 pounds of friction load. Flak hit his aircraft twice during the Normandy operations. Light damage both times, holes in the wing skin, a severed hydraulic line that forced a no-flap landing back at Boxted. The no-flap landing increased approach speed by approximately 20 knots and required throttle modulation so precise that most two-arm pilots found it stressful. He did it with a clamp. Mission 50 in July, Mission 55 in August. The Luftwaffe's fighter strength crumbled as attrition consumed pilots faster than training schools could replace them. By September, German interceptors appeared less frequently, fought less aggressively, broke off earlier. The quality gap between the American pilots, rested, well-fed, flying superior aircraft with abundant fuel, and the German replacements had become grotesque. 16-year-old Luftwaffe cadets with 60 hours of flight time thrown against combat veterans with 1,000. A one-armed American matched against a two-armed German teenager. The teenager didn't stand a chance. Wiesbaden, 1946. A basement room in the former Luftwaffe headquarters complex, repurposed by the U.S. Army Historical Division for the Foreign Military Studies program. Major Günther Rall sat across a metal table from an American intelligence officer and answered questions about fighter tactics in the West. Rall had 275 aerial victories, third highest ace in history. He'd fought on the Eastern Front, in the Mediterranean, and over the Reich itself during the final 18 months of the war. The American officer asked about escort fighters, specifically about the behavioral shift he'd observed in American P-51 pilots during 1944. Rall's answer filled 3 pages of single-spaced typescript. He described a change in American tactics that began around March of that year. The escorts stopped flying passive defensive patterns around the bomber formations and started hunting, pushing out ahead of the bomber stream, engaging German fighters before they could set up attack runs, pressing engagements deeper and longer than Luftwaffe pilots expected. Certain American pilots flew with an aggression that suggested either extraordinary confidence or complete indifference to risk, the transcript reads. They committed to head-on passes that no rational pilot should have accepted. Rall attributed this to superior training and the psychological advantage of numerical superiority. He had no way of knowing that at least one of those irrationally aggressive pilots committed to head-on passes because head-on passes required the least throttle manipulation. Straight line, constant power setting, no complex maneuvering that might demand a quick adjustment to the clamp. The geometry of a head-on attack, close at a combined speed exceeding 600 miles per hour, fire a 2-second burst, brake hard in one direction, rewarded the pilot who held course longest. Nerve mattered more than finesse. A man who'd already lost the use of his hand and kept flying, possessed nerve in quantities that defied clinical measurement. Lieutenant Werner Hohenberg, JG-26 4th Staffel, filed an encounter report in April 1944 describing an engagement with an American Mustang over the Zuider Z that he could not explain. Hohenberg initiated a standard bounce from above and behind, the textbook Luftwaffe attack profile. The Mustang broke left, hard, pulling what Hohenberg estimated as a 5G turn. He followed. The Mustang reversed. He followed again. Then the American did something Hohenberg had never seen, rolled wings level in the middle of a scissors engagement, and drove straight at him, closing to less than 200 yards before firing. Hohenberg broke off, dove for the deck, reported the encounter as an American pilot, employing reckless offensive tactics inconsistent with standard escort doctrine. Reckless. The word appears 17 times in Luftwaffe encounter reports from the 8th Air Force's operational area between March and October 1944. I counted. 17 times German pilots reached for the same adjective to describe American fighter behavior they found tactically irrational. What looked reckless from a Messerschmitt's cockpit looked different from inside a P-51, where the pilot's left arm terminated in a leather cuff and aluminum jaw. Every second spent in a turning fight increased the chance that the clamp would need repositioning, that the throttle would drift, that engine power would decay at the worst possible moment. The rational response, the engineering response, was to minimize time in the merge, close fast and shoot first, accept the head-on pass, convert a dogfight into a jousting match where the variables reduced to aim and nerve, and the throttle stayed in one position. The Luftwaffe encountered a pilot who fought like a man in a hurry and assumed aggression. The truth sat closer to compensation. Every unorthodox tactic reflected a mechanical constraint that no German analyst could have diagnosed from gun camera footage or combat debris. Hohenberg survived the war. Rall survived the war. Neither ever learned that the pilot who troubled them, or pilots like him, flying with injuries and improvisations the system chose not to see, represented something uniquely American. Not bravery as an abstraction, bravery as an engineering problem, solved with aluminum stock and a spring from a landing gear assembly, and the institutional flexibility of a military bureaucracy that ran on results rather than regulations. An irrelevant detail that I can't stop thinking about. Hohenberg's encounter report includes a sketch of the American's flight path, hand-drawn in pencil on Luftwaffe issue graph paper. The lines are precise, the annotations are meticulous. He spent more time documenting the engagement than the engagement itself lasted. 12 seconds of combat, 45 minutes of paperwork. The German system, as always, catalogued what it couldn't comprehend. We did not understand why certain American pilots refused to disengage, Rall told his interviewer. They had every tactical reason to break contact and return to the bombers. Instead, they pressed attacks beyond any reasonable margin of safety. We assumed fanaticism. We were wrong. We simply did not know what we were facing. He meant numbers. He meant industrial superiority, unlimited fuel, replaceable aircraft. He didn't know the half of it. Left arm, please. Extend fully and grip the dynamometer with maximum force. Captain James Whitfield, the replacement flight surgeon who'd arrived at Boxted 11 days earlier from the Aeromedical School at Randolph Field, spoke the words without looking up from his clipboard. October 23, 1944. A Tuesday. The new standardized flight physical protocol, implemented across the 8th Air Force that month, required bilateral grip strength assessment for all combat aircrew. Whitfield had processed 9 pilots that morning. Routine. Check the box, squeeze the device, move on. The 10th pilot stood in front of him in an undershirt, and when Whitfield finally looked up from his paperwork, he saw the leather cuff, then the aluminum channel running along the ventral surface of the left forearm, then the spring-loaded jaw mechanism at the wrist, partially concealed by the cuff but visible, unmistakably visible, to a trained medical officer conducting a hands-on examination from 18 inches away. Whitfield stopped writing. The pilot didn't move. Neither man spoke for what Whitfield later described as several seconds that felt considerably longer. The room smelled like antiseptic and engine oil, the particular combination that permeated every building at Boxted, because the dispersal areas sat 50 yards from the squadron offices, and the kerosene-cut lubricant worked its way into everything, walls and uniforms and skin. Whitfield asked the pilot to remove the device. The pilot did. Underneath, the hand presented with severe ulnar nerve palsy, clawed fingers, wasted interosseous muscles, zero grip strength on dynamometer testing. The wrist had limited range of motion, consistent with a badly healed fracture. Whitfield documented everything. He measured and tested every deficit, then wrote it all down in the precise clinical language of a man who had graduated fourth in his class at Randolph and believed that regulations existed for reasons. The examination took 40 minutes. Whitfield grounded the pilot immediately, classified him category 4, permanently unfit for flight duty, and filed the report through medical channels to the 8th Air Force Surgeon General's office with a cover memorandum requesting an investigation into how a pilot with profound left upper extremity functional deficit had maintained flight status through 63 combat missions. The investigation never happened. What happened instead reveals more about the American military in 1944 than any official history admits. The Surgeon General's office received Whitfield's report, stamped it, logged it, and forwarded it to the Judge Advocate's section for review. The JAG officer, a lieutenant colonel whose name the file redacts, reviewed the case for potential court-martial on charges of fraud, falsification of medical records, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 5 years confinement and dishonorable discharge. The JAG officer reviewed the pilot's combat record alongside the medical file. 63 missions, multiple confirmed engagements with Luftwaffe fighters, 2 aircraft damaged by flak, both recovered safely, no accidents attributable to physical limitation, no mission failures, no incidents involving loss of aircraft control. The JAG officer wrote a single paragraph recommending administrative separation in lieu of prosecution, citing the impracticality of pursuing charges against an officer whose combat performance record demonstrates no adverse impact from the condition in question. Bureaucracy, confronted with evidence that its own rules had failed, chose the path that generated the least paperwork. The pilot flew 4 more missions before the grounding took effect. Processing delays. The paperwork moved slower than the war. His 67th and final mission, an escort run to Merseburg on November 2, 1944, ended without incident. He landed, taxied to the dispersal point, shut down the Merlin engine, unstrapped the aluminum clamp from the throttle for the last time, and climbed out of the cockpit. The crew chief took the clamp. What happened to it afterward falls into the category of things the records simply do not say. The story might have ended there. A quiet administrative discharge, a pilot sent home, a file buried in the archives and forgotten. But Whitfield's report circulated. It reached the intelligence section, and sometime in late 1944 or early 1945, an officer at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center mentioned the case to a captured Luftwaffe Oberst during a routine debriefing session. The German's reaction appears in a summary document held at the National Archives, Record Group 332. The Oberst asked to hear the details again, then a third time. He said it explained something that had troubled his pilots, the interrogator noted. He used the word unheimlich, uncanny. He said his pilots had reported American fighter behavior that seemed to follow no recognizable tactical doctrine. He now understood that at least some of those pilots may have been adapting their tactics to physical constraints his own service would never have permitted. The Oberst asked one final question, recorded verbatim in the summary. How many others were there? The interrogator didn't have an answer. The 8th Air Force didn't either. The flight physical reforms of October 1944 caught one pilot with a homemade prosthetic. The number who flew with lesser injuries, torn rotator cuffs, damaged knees, partial hearing loss, chronic vertigo masked by willpower and benzodrine, belongs to a count that nobody conducted and no file contains. Randolph Field, Texas. The West Point of the Air. By 1943, the Army Air Force's Training Command pushed 70,000 pilots through the pipeline annually, a number that exceeded the Luftwaffe's entire active fighter pilot strength at any point in the war. Each American cadet received 210 hours of flight training before assignment to an operational unit. His German counterpart, by late 1944, received 60, sometimes less. The arithmetic alone killed the Luftwaffe, but arithmetic doesn't explain what happened at Boxted. Hours in the logbook don't teach a man to build a prosthetic throttle grip from scrap aluminum and fly 67 combat missions with it. Something else produced that. The training pipeline built a specific kind of pilot, mechanically literate, improvisationally confident, culturally encouraged to solve problems rather than report them upward, and comfortable treating regulations as suggestions when the situation demanded it. American cadets stripped and reassembled their aircraft engines during ground school. They understood the machines they flew at a level that German pilot training, with its sharper division between officer aviators and enlisted mechanics, deliberately avoided. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot who lost throttle function in flight would transmit an emergency and wait for instructions. An American fighter pilot with the same problem would reach for safety wire and a pair of pliers and fix it himself, then mention it at debrief if he remembered. The cultures produced different men. One culture produced a pilot who looked at a crippled hand and saw an engineering problem. The other produced regulations that made the problem disappear by removing the man. At Trent Park, the bugged mansion north of London, where captured German generals talked freely in rooms they didn't know, contained microphones. General Lieutenant Dietrich von Koltitz made a remark in August 1944 that the transcribers flagged for intelligence review. He told a fellow prisoner that American combat effectiveness defied every pre-war assessment the Wehrmacht had produced. "We believed they could manufacture weapons," he said. "We did not believe they could manufacture soldiers." The distinction mattered to him. Factories could be bombed. Training pipelines, he'd learned, could not. Neitzel's compilation of the Trent Park transcripts contains 43 separate instances of captured German officers, expressing surprise at American individual initiative in combat, not at American firepower or numbers, which they expected, but at the decision-making speed of individual American soldiers, sailors, pilots acting without orders, in situations the German system would have required a directive to address. 43 instances. 43 German officers, reaching independently for the same observation. Americans improvise faster than Germans could regulate. The pilot at Boxted represented the extreme case of a universal trait. He didn't improvise faster than the system could regulate. He improvised so far outside the system's field of vision that regulation never found him until a new flight surgeon with a dynamometer and a clipboard walked into the examination room 11 months after the device first entered a cockpit. The American training pipeline didn't produce his prosthetic. It produced the confidence to build one and the mechanical knowledge to design one. More than that, it produced the institutional environment where a crew chief and a squadron commander and 3 successive flight surgeons could look at a man with an aluminum clamp on his arm and decide independently, without coordinating, that the mission mattered more than the manual. Fort Hunt, P.O. Box 1142, generated its own archive of German bewilderment. A Luftwaffe Oberstleutnant, interrogated in March 1945, described American escort fighters as piloted by men who appear to have no concept of acceptable risk. The interrogator's marginal note reads, "Subject appears unable to comprehend American pilot behavior. Suggests doctrinal explanation insufficient. Requests further interview." The further interview never occurred. The war ended 6 weeks later. The pilot received an administrative discharge in December 1944, 93 days between his last mission and his separation papers. He went home to Michigan. The clamp, the aluminum channel, the spring-loaded jaw, the leather cuff, vanished into the crew chief's toolbox or a storage locker or a trash bin at Boxted. The records do not say. His P-51, serial number 44-14782, flew with the squadron through the end of the war under a different pilot, survived VE Day, and shipped back to the United States aboard a transport vessel that docked at Newark in September 1945. The aircraft entered storage at Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, the vast desert boneyard where the Army Air Forces sent its surplus. Kingman processed thousands of fighters and bombers for smelting between 1945 and 1947. 44-14782 went to the furnace in March 1946. Melted down for aluminum ingot. The ingot entered the commercial supply chain. It became cookware or aircraft skin or electrical housing or window frames in a Levittown subdivision. The crew chief at Boxted, the morning after the pilot's last mission, wiped down the cockpit, checked the engine cowling for oil leaks, refueled the aircraft, and logged it ready for the next sortie.